What's up, everybody? Welcome to the program. Appreciate it. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and that rumble button or the like button, depending on which platform you're actually watching this video on. So I was trying to get my dinner together, and lo and behold, as the news gets a hold of me. Usually I turn the news off after my radio show, but had to go with this one. So here's the deal. Biden is once again lying to everybody, hence the title of the video, and because Biden is a lying liar, and that's just who Biden is. So I wanted to go ahead and show you this. This is at the speech today. So today is the 23rd, June 23rd, 2021. This is the speech that Biden was given on guns, gun violence, ghost guns, all of that stuff. It's always amazing to watch somebody who doesn't know anything about firearms talk about it. And I know Biden's a gun owner. He talks about shotguns. Hey, just shoot the bad guy through the door. Don't even identify the target. There's actually a guy who used the Biden defense in court because he did what Biden suggested at one point when he was the vice president. Yeah, that guy lost his case and got convicted. You can't shoot at somebody through the door or a window or what have you. So anyway, Joe Biden goes out there, and I just want to play this one part because this is something that people fundamentally just do not understand. Okay? We're not here to debate the Second Amendment or anything like that because, frankly, you either believe in the Second Amendment or you're un-American. I don't know how else to describe it. So here's the deal. I want you to just listen to this. I want you to listen to the former vice president, the usurper in chief. I want you to listen to what he says when he makes this statement. So I'm going to make sure the volume is turned up, but it's a little bit quieter than I am. So just have a listen to what Biden said about this, and then we're going to address that on the other end.
I might add, the Second Amendment from the day it was passed limited the type of people who could own a gun and what type of weapon you could own.
No, it didn't. No, it didn't. This is crystal clear historical fact. Now, what I find interesting about this, Breitbart covered this too. Joe Biden, Second Amendment had limits from day one. No, it didn't. That's historically inaccurate. It did not have limits. Now, we'll get to what I mean by that in just a second. But Joe Biden has said this before. He has made this exact claim before, and he has been fact-checked before. Anybody who knows anything about history, and this is going to require more than just the cursory internet search here, but anybody who knows anything about history knows that there were no limits on what you can own. Okay? Now hold on. Let's go back to this. I want you to listen to this. This is imperative that you hear what he says now.
Couldn't buy a cannon. Those who say the blood of the...
You couldn't buy cannon, huh? Actually, you could. You could own cannon. Now, you could make the cannon yourself. You could import it. You could buy it. Whatever. You could own cannon. That was actually commonplace. A lot of founding fathers owned their own cannon. You can own cannon now. Now, it requires a little extra effort for you to own a cannon now, but you can still own a cannon. Now, back when the Second Amendment was passed, because remember, you got the Revolution, you got the Articles of Confederation, and eventually dissolving those and having the Constitution of the United States and the Second Amendment, the arguments with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalist Papers and everything else. Look, if you're ever confused about what is in the Constitution of the United States, go read the Federalist Papers. That is an explanation of why the Constitution was written the way that it was and what it was designed to accomplish. So if there's ever any confusion at all, just read the Federalist Papers. And in the Federalist Papers, they made this crystal clear that the citizen population should have access to the same amount of, the same types of ammunition, or I should say armaments, should have access to the same armaments as the government does. Period. That's full stop. That is exactly what the Founding Fathers wanted. That is exactly what they advocated for. That is exactly what they argued for in the Federalist Papers. That's all there is to it. Now, Biden, again, has made this claim before, that from day one, the Second Amendment had limits on it. No, it did not. You couldn't buy cannon. Yes, you could. Now, here's a fact check. This is the Austin American-Statesman. This was originally published in PolitiFact, a left-wing fact-checking source, okay? I just want to make this, because there's always going to be somebody out there, you're going to pull John Lott out. I don't need to pull John Lott out for this. This is a historic, universal fact. There isn't any historian who disagrees with this. So, June 29th, 2020, PolitiFact, Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee, recently sat for a video with Wired magazine, part of the magazine's series of interviews in which celebrities answer the most searched for questions about themselves on the internet. One of the questions Biden addressed was, what is Joe Biden's stance on gun control? He hates all guns except for shotguns. That's it. Shotguns far more likely to be used in mass shootings than AR-15s, but I digress. He proceeded to answer that he favors outlawing assault weapons, which he can't define. And then he gives this statement here. I have no rationale for being, they have no rationale for being owned by individuals on the street. Of course, this comes from somebody who's never had to have anybody, never had to fend for themselves, never had to hunt for themselves. AR-15s are actually very, very common up in the very cold regions. They're really good when you're dealing with the wild animals in Alaska. But I digress. I don't need to get into all of that. That's not what we're here for, okay? They should be outlawed from the very beginning. You weren't allowed to have certain weapons. False. You weren't allowed to own cannon during the Revolutionary War as an individual. False. False. Now, again, the fact check on this is that it is false, okay? So PolitiFact did that. To confirm Biden's point, you would need to point to something, a law or a tradition, or a case where someone was not allowed to possess a cannon, said University of Pennsylvania law professor, but the Biden campaign was unable to point to a specific law. And that is because it doesn't exist. Now, PolitiFact rated that as false because, well, shocker, it's false. A lot of people own cannon, okay? Now, you had to be wealthy. They weren't a common man sort of piece of hardware. You had to be wealthy, but you could own cannon. You could make cannon, you could own cannon, you could import cannon. It could be on your property. You could use it to defend your farm if you wanted to. You could lend it to the government if you were a commanding officer in an army. If you served in the colonial army or whatever else, or your local militia, you were certainly allowed to bring that cannon with you. This is, again, an undeniable historical fact. Why Biden keeps repeating this claim is beyond me. But again, the left constantly, just like Goebbels, they repeat the lie over and over and over again. And the average, idiot out there will go, oh, so you weren't even allowed to own cannon back then. You know what else you were allowed to own? You were allowed to own warships. So if we really wanted to go back, okay, if we really wanted to go back to the Revolutionary era, you should be able to own a destroyer, because they were. A lot of founding fathers owned their own naval vessels with cannon. Now, if you couldn't own cannon, how could you own a naval warship with cannon on it? Joe, how could you do that? John Hancock famously owned several naval warships. He wasn't the only founding father who did. You were allowed to own a warship if you had the means to do so. You were allowed to own cannon if you had the means to do so. You were allowed to own the Giordani rifle if you had the means to do so. Were they commonplace? No, but you were legally allowed to do that. Now, here's the thing about limits, okay? What ends up happening is you start getting a bunch of anti-gun types, and what they will do is they will go back in time, and they will say, well, this state had this restriction, and that state had that restriction, and everything else. Okay, yeah, you could do that. Some of that stuff predates the Constitution. Some of it is post-Constitution, okay? But it just depends on who's writing the article. I don't need to dive into all of that, because the main point here is that once again, Joe Biden has said something stupid and is untrue. And he keeps repeating this claim, even though he's been fact-checked on it numerous times. But he's known for that. Leftists are known for that in general. Politicians are known for that in general, okay? But what he is saying here is just fundamentally untrue. You could own cannons back in the day, the Revolutionary era, the colonial era, whatever you want to call it, both before and after the Second Amendment were passed. You also could own warships with numerous cannon on top. You could own semi-automatic air rifles, okay? You could own those. That is a fact. This is undeniable. They were available at the time. You could own them. There was no restriction upon owning them. The Founding Fathers, the federal government, nobody had any restrictions on any of that. There was no limit on who could own firearms when the Second Amendment was passed. Now, here's where they get their little manipulations. The Second Amendment, in the way that the Founding Fathers set up the government after the Constitution, the federal government could not restrict firearm ownership. And then the state constitutions, which followed, they would pass their own interpretations of all of this, which was in accordance with the federal constitution. So there were states that did have some limits on where you could be armed. Some states required that you owned a firearm, and they required that you, in fact, trained with it on a regular basis. You were mandated to do so. So if you want to go back to that era, I always like mentioning this. If you really want to go back to that era, okay, should everybody be required to own a firearm then? Because there were some states who did that. I'm opposed to that. But the federal government has no jurisdiction to make those rules. This is a fundamental fact of constitutional history. The federal government doesn't get to make those rules. States have much more power to make those rules than the federal government does. But those rules cannot impede what the federal Constitution says. So again, there were states, just like there are now, who get a little creative with their language. And we're not going to take away your right to own a gun. Yeah, not at all. But you can't have a gun here. Okay, that's what we do now. If you were to actually dive into the language of the Second Amendment, is that an infringement upon your Second Amendment rights? Yeah. But it's also something that, as time has gone on in the courts and in the way that society is kind of, we've kind of like, okay, well, fine, some places, whatever, we won't do it, right? Maybe we won't carry a gun into a courthouse or a federal building or something of that nature. There are those who disagree with that. But fundamentally, the Second Amendment doesn't really allow for that restriction, but because their states' rights did push that, and eventually it just became a part of the lexicon of how we deal with firearms. But there were states who had some restrictions, but none of that came from the federal government. The Second Amendment itself has no restrictions on who can own a firearm. Criminals not being able to own a firearm didn't happen until much, much later. Thank you, NRA. That didn't happen until much, much later. That's not something that was present at the beginning of the Constitution and the Second Amendment. That didn't exist, guys. It was a completely different world, and you can argue it was a completely different world. That was not something that they considered. No. Now, eventually, states started doing that. Eventually, the state politics infected federal politics, and we've had this circular Second Amendment debate happening for some time now. But the fundamental fact that Joe Biden continues to lie about this, and that anti-gun activists continue to lie about this, is not perplexing, but it's frustrating because, again, this is the use of Goebbels model. We will repeat the lie often enough, and then eventually people will believe it. Joe Biden is lying to you. And here's the thing. He's not mistaken. He's lying because he knows that this is not true. Because he's been fact-checked on it. He's been told this. He knows it's inaccurate. Even with his dementia, he knows that this is the case. There were no limits on who could own firearms when the Second Amendment was passed. There were no limits on what type of firearm you could own. Yes, there were firearms that would qualify for assault weapons under modern legislative language, and they were perfectly legal and perfectly allowed back in colonial days after the Revolution, after the Second Amendment and the Constitution were established. Also, you could, in fact, own cannon. You could own as many cannon as you wanted. You could own naval warships. You could actually participate in naval blockades. You could go to war with pirates if you really wanted to, and you could shoot at them with cannon while they shot back at you with cannon. All of that was perfectly legal after the Constitution of the United States was ratified. And anybody who tells you otherwise is a liar. They're not mistaken. They're a liar because it doesn't take any effort or any time to actually figure this out. Now, just because, for the sake of argument, and I want to tweak a couple of anti-gun activists. So this is the Giordani rifle. This is an air rifle that was manufactured during the Revolution. They were available to some colonial soldiers and units. Some people did carry them, but they're not commonplace, okay? And nobody is trying to say that this was the commonplace rifle or anything else at the time. But this was legal. This was available. And under the Second Amendment, you were allowed to own one, and there were no restrictions. And if you were to look at some of the anti-gun language, the assault weapons bans that they have proposed over the time, this would actually be a banned gun under the modern definition of assault weapon. It is semi-automatic, just like AR-15s, has a similar fire rate, such as AR-15s. It is, you could argue, suppressed. It is extremely quiet. You'll hear that in a minute. It is, in fact, quieter than a lot of suppressed rifles now would be. And, of course, they would be banned because of the suppressors. Suppressors are highly restricted. So there are things about this that would actually qualify it for a ban list in an assault weapons legislative body. So here, take a look at this. And by legislative body, I mean, obviously, the legislation itself. But just want you to watch this guy shoot this rifle. Again, this is, you know, this is, what is it, 46 cal? Yeah, 46 caliber. Okay, so again, high caliber, way bigger bullet than we're dealing with, right? So I want you to just listen, watch how fast he's able to put rounds down range.
Anytime you're ready. Set.
Real quiet. See how quiet that is? Look how fast he's able to fire. Now, back then, I mean, that's a game changer. It's a game changer. And Napoleon was famously afraid of them. Now, were they commonplace? No. Were they expensive? Yes. Did they exist? Were they manufactured and available at the time? Did people in the colonies own them? Yes. Were they restricted by the Second Amendment? No. Were cannons restricted by the Second Amendment? No. Were naval warships restricted by the Second Amendment? No. Did the Second Amendment restrict who could own a firearm? No. All of those things are lies. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit that Rumble button, hit that like button, depending on where you're watching this video, and tell all of your friends about it. I'm trying to regrow the YouTube channel, but our primary channel is Rumble. And again, we do the daily live stream of my radio show on Rumble at rumble.com/Casey the host every single weekday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. All right, folks, take care. Thanks for watching.